американский посол, если вы не знаете. Добро пожаловать в Спаса Хаус. Кто здесь первый раз? О, отлично. Это что мы делали. Кто-то мне написал на Фейсбуке, вы можете меня найти на Фейсбуке или на Твиттер, почему вы не приходили бы к нам в МГИМО, или МГУ, или где-то вышка, или так далее, да? И я уже чувствовал, это уже было где-то 3-4 недели тому назад, и я уже чувствовал, что мы не успеем ничего не делать с студентами до лета. Поэтому мы решили делать что-то экзотическое. Именно это мероприятие. Да? То есть мы не успеем к вам, поэтому мы вас пригласим. Если получится, мы это повторим, может быть, каждый квартал. И я уже чувствую, если я вижу, сколько людей, я ни разу не видел здесь в Спаса Хаус, это значит, что есть спрос, есть интерес, и вы можете написать на Твиттер и на Фейсбук ваши оценки сегодня вечером, и тогда мы будем решить, повторить или нет. Хорошо, давайте, я все-таки, мы не знали, какой язык говорить. Кто хочет, чтобы я говорил на английском языке? Ага. А кто на русском? Вот, поскольку мы уважаем демократический процесс, я с удовольствием буду говорить на английском языке. Но как компромисс, потому что надо уважать меньшинство в демократическом процессе тоже, у нас будут слайды на русском языке. И я первый раз это делал, я никогда не попробовал, я не знал, как это будет получается, но давайте делаем маленький эксперимент, и если будет какой-то ошибка, мы попытаемся фиксировать. Хорошо. All right, I'm going to speak in English now. Welcome to Spasa House. Is there anybody here that does not speak Russian? Okay, good. Oh, we found you. You're here. You made it. We met on Facebook, right? Nice to see you in person. So my name is Michael McFaul. Let me do the whole introduction just for you again. I'm just kidding. My name is Michael McFaul, Ambassador McFaul. Welcome to Spasa House. Here's what I want to do today. I want to present to you my perspective, and I want to emphasize it's my perspective on how I perceive how President Obama sees the world, what that means for our foreign policy priorities, and then finally at the end, help you understand what that means for U.S.-Russian relations. What I'm deliberately not going to do today is a talk purely about U.S.-Russian relations. That's not what I plan to do today. Because we can do that in other places, you can read about it, we have lots of expertise in the room. But what I thought would be useful to give a bigger context so that you have a better understanding of Obama's vision of the world. Because sometimes when I read things that are stated about him and about our administration, I think there's some misperceptions about the way he sees the world. So that's the design of the talk, okay? Now, by way of background, I know that a lot of you know my background, but for those of you who don't, just let me say that I've been ambassador here for about 1.5 years now. I came in January of 2012. Before that, I worked for 3 years at the White House. My title was Special Assistant to the President for Russian and Eurasian Affairs. And I worked for him there because for 2 years before that, I worked for Senator Obama on his campaign, his presidential campaign from 2006 to 2008. So I've now worked for President Obama for 7 years. And there are very few people left from the original core foreign policy advisors in the government. So I tell you that just because I come at this particular talk with that background in mind. Okay? So let's start. One last thing I want to say. This is not a press conference. We deliberately, is there any press here? Good. Well, don't raise your hand. This is not a press conference. This is not on the record. I'm not here to do that. That's a different setting, and that requires a different format and a different give and go. This is more hopefully, where I'm going to go through these slides very fast so that we can get to your discussions and questions, okay? All right, so let's get going. President Obama's worldview, implications for Russia. Anybody from Russia? He spoke there 4 years ago, and it was a fantastic event, and I was honored to be there. And by the way, I'm going to paraphrase what he said at Resh 4 years ago. But the best statement about Obama's view towards Russia, in my view, still today, is the speech that he gave at Resh. And you can find it easily on my Facebook or on our websites for the embassy. Okay, let me start with some big conceptual pieces first. His philosophy about international affairs generally. One, President Obama, in interaction with other leaders around the world, is always seeking what he calls, and it's a phrase he uses, win-win outcomes. And he rejects, by philosophical view, the notion that relations between states have to be zero-sum. Now, I know there's a lot of students out there who study international relations. And I should mention, before I joined the White House, I taught at Stanford University for many, many years. Anybody ever heard of Stanford? Okay. I consider it, I really respect all universities. I consider it to be the greatest university in the world. That's my view. It's just my personal view, but I have the data to show it. No, but for those of you who are in international relations, you should recognize this, because in international relations theory, there's a big debate about this in terms of realist school of thought versus institutionalist schools of thought. Obama, on that divide, is very clearly in one theoretical school. Second, mutual respect. If you read any of President Obama's speeches, about foreign policy especially, but not only about foreign policy, you'll see that he uses this phrase a lot. A lot. And the reason is because of his background, of who his father was, of who his mother was. Very important to understand his mother and her background and her interests. And the fact that with his mother, he lived abroad for many years. If you put all that together, he has a unique perspective on how to understand the other person's point of view around the world. And I would say, I don't want to get in trouble with my friends from the Bush administration or the Clinton administration, but I would say this is something unique that President Obama brings to the Oval Office. That he doesn't always agree with everybody on the other side of the table, but he can demonstrate empathy and have respect for lots of different kinds of people around the world. Third, most major foreign policy issues do not fit within the borders of nation states. And now this is also for you IR theorists out there. This is a very controversial statement as well, because there are some, Ken Waltz, for instance, a great international relations theorist who just died recently. I knew Ken Waltz when he taught at Berkeley, and he was a very traditional realist, right? Realpolitik guy, and he always dismissed this idea. And he said basically all states, the issue about international relations is the things that happen between states. President Obama thinks that there are a lot of issues that cannot be defined within the borders of the state that are transnational, including values, security issues, and economic issues. Okay, and now just to move on, I'm going to skip over these quickly. But I want to make sure you don't think I'm just BSing you. I didn't say that word, but I'm trying to be diplomatic. Just a few quotes from the president, just so you know. This is a phrase from his speech at the New Economic School. The pursuit of power is no longer a zero-sum game. Progress must be shared. Now, if you can't see the photo, this is the American Embassy hockey team playing the Ministry of Economic Development's hockey team. I'm pretty sure we lost pretty badly, but we felt like it's a win-win outcome for both sides. And to move on, mutual respect. Again, I wanted to just quote the president just a little bit here. It is easier to start wars than to end them. It is easier to blame others than to look inward. It is easier to see what is different about someone than to define the things we share. Next, universal values, which when we get to the end, I think is probably part of what some of the more controversial parts of Barack Obama's view of the world. But here's what he said to the General Assembly in the year 2010. And by the way, myśl pročem, I deliberately chose quotes here that were from various different settings, not just about Russia, so that you get a sense of his worldview, right? And here's what he says about universal values. We stand for universal values because it's the right thing to do. But we also know from experience that those who defend these values for their people have been our closest friends and allies, while those who have denied those rights, whether terrorist groups or tyrannical governments, have chosen to be our adversaries. Now, I want to dwell on this a little bit. In fact, next slide, please. And you can, I won't read these, but these are other statements that he made when he was here in Moscow 4 years ago that basically say something similar. I want you to think about this hard because oftentimes I hear people say, well, why do you promote universal values? Well, it's not it's none of your business. Sovereignty. Don't meddle in the internal affairs of other countries. That's a debate we have in your country, and that's a debate we have in a lot of countries around the world. And I think it's important to understand, you don't have to agree with me, but I want you to understand that there is what I would call a normative motivation for promoting universal values, as well as an interest-based reason for promoting universal values. And the president, when he was here in Russia, outlined the basic arguments in his speech here as well as when he spoke at the General Assembly. And again, I know because we're all students. If you're a student of international relations theory, this is the debate about what's called the democratic peace theory. This is a giant debate in the academic literature. It's a giant debate. And again, President Obama is on one side of that debate fairly firmly. Okay, that's the theory, big perspective, right? How does that translate into policy priorities for our government and our administration? And by the way, I should have said at the beginning, I am not going to say a word about Russian, President Putin and the Putin administration and Russia's view of the world. That's a different lecture for somebody else to do. That is not my business. You have your teachers, you have your ways to tackle it yourself. I'm just focusing strictly on our perspective as administration and how it translates into policy. Okay, I should have said that at the beginning. 6 priorities, okay? I'm going to go through these quickly. 1, ending wars. That should be fairly obvious by now what a giant priority that is for President Obama, especially now that we're in year 5 of the administration. 2, fighting Al-Qaeda and other terrorists. 3rd, the Asia pivot. 4th, the Prague agenda. 5th, expanding markets. And 6th, supporting universal values. Those are our priorities. And I'm going to we'll come back to them. And I'm going to tell you how they relate to Russia. But these are our foreign policy priorities in the world. Notice that I did not put on the list better relations with China. I didn't put on the list better relations with Russia. I didn't put on the list worse relations with Syria. In other words, the way we're defining our priorities is about our security objectives and our economic objectives according to the way we see the world. And then the means for achieving those are about engagement with other states and other countries. And let me talk about that next, right? So this is the means, right? And I would say there are 4 most important, but I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about engagement when we get to Russia. So engagement. How do you realize those objectives? Our view as an administration is through engagement. Now I want to again focus on the counterfactual or the null hypothesis in academia. There's a different way to pursue the same objectives, but through different means. And in our history of our country, there have been times where less engagement and containment, for instance, including with big chunks of history with your country in the 20th century, was the strategy for achieving those ends. We debated this stuff during the transition in 2008, in the fall of 2008. We had a big debate about means, and this is where we came out. Second, strengthening international institutions. We believe this is a means for us to achieve the ends that I outlined. Again, this one I would say may be the most controversial difference between our administration and the previous administration. The Bush administration was not as focused on strengthening international institutions as we are. And they still criticize us, by the way, for focusing too much on international institutions, including, by the way, ones where Russia has a major voice, and first and foremost, the UN Security Council. Third, restoring America's image abroad, a priority that was set right in the beginning of the administration, and I'll bet we'll have some debate about that during questions and answers. And fourth, the use of force only as a last resort. Those are about the means for achieving those ends. Now, on engagement, I won't read this all right now. In fact, I'll just let you read it. But it's so important for the president to emphasize this strategy that he put it in the most important speech of his second term in office, which is his inaugural speech that he gave in January of 2013. And you'll see what he said. Can everybody read that back there or not really? Yeah? You know what? Yeah, she's out there. Not listening again. We will defend our people and uphold our values through strength of arms and rule of law. We will show the courage to try and resolve our differences with other nations peacefully, not because we are naive about the dangers we face, but because engagement can be more durable, can more durably lift suspicion and fear. Now that is a very controversial statement within American debates as well, because a lot of people within the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, it's not a partisan issue, but a lot of foreign policy experts believe that our administration has spent too much time on engagement and not enough time on confrontation. Okay, that was really quick. We'll talk about it more in depth in a minute. But now I want to spend the next 15 minutes, and I'm going to try to go through this fast. So put your seatbelts on. How does all this apply, and next slide please, to policy towards Russia? This photo, by the way, if you can't see it, this was my first day in the Oval Office working. This was 3 days after the swearing in, and he's about to call your president right there, President Medvedev. And just so you know, I didn't quite know the protocol of the Oval Office. You're actually not supposed to touch his desk. But nobody told me that before I walked in for the first time. So how does all this conceptual piece and our priorities apply to our relations with Russia? Let's go. I want to go through this quick because it's, in a way, it's repeating some of the things I just said. First, the United States and Russia shares common interests. He believes in win-win outcomes when it comes to relations with your country. And I apologize when I say your country. I know not everybody's from Russia here, but forgive me. If I know somebody's from Kyrgyzstan, I used to be in charge of Kyrgyzstan at the White House too. I know he would say the same thing if we were talking about Kyrgyzstan. Two, we need to develop a multi-dimensional relationship with Russia. And by that, he means security, economics, society. And let me tell you a little story from when we were negotiating the New START Treaty. We were talking about telemetry. How many people here know what telemetry is? Good. That is progress. Nobody raised their hand. And that is a fantastic sign that the Cold War is dying and is over. Because 30 or 40 years ago, in a room just like this, with students just like you would have all knew what telemetry was. I was a student like you, and we had to know it. And the fact that you didn't raise your hand is an excellent sign of what the President was saying to us. Because we were talking about it, we're in a big argument on the START Treaty about it, and at one point he just said, okay, I know I got to understand what this is, and I know we have to deal with this. But we cannot spend the next 8 years with the Russians just talking about telemetry. And remind you, he said that in 2009. He was already thinking he's going to be around for 8 years, right? And the idea is that that's part of our Cold War legacy. And it's our responsibility as global nuclear powers to engage on these issues. But we have to develop these other dimensions that we didn't develop in previous times. Third, again, following from the slides I already said about his vision globally, he firmly believes that greater engagement with Russia will lead to and produce these win-win outcomes. And that, as a minimum, greater engagement will at least ensure that when we disagree, we're disagreeing about facts and not misperceptions. President Obama believes that firmly. What drives him nuts is that when we go in and we say, well, Mr. President, they have a misperception of our policy. And he will say to us, well, fix it. Talk clearer. McFaul, speak more clearly. Practice your Russian. Make sure they understand our policy. And at the end of the day, if we cannot agree, we need to make sure that we're agreeing to disagree based on a common set of facts, not on a misperception of facts. He believes that very strongly. Fourth, engagement with Russia and with most countries around the world is what we call dual-track engagement. That is engagement with the state and society. And I'll say more about that in a second. Fifth, reset. That is reset relations with Russia cannot come at the expense of relations with other countries, especially other countries in this region of the world. And sixth, we seek consciously to avoid linkage between issues that we believe are unrelated. And I should just say as a footnote, that also is a very controversial issue. And members of our Congress, if you follow the debate about the Magnitsky List, for instance, some people in our political society as a whole disagree with us and are consciously trying to link unrelated issues. Our policy is to avoid linkage. Okay, practice of engagement. Now let me just flip through these really quickly. It means in 4 different levels: leaders, governments, business, and society. First, leaders. So, these are 2 photos from when we were here in July 2009. Spent a great deal of time engaging with President Medvedev, but we also had a fantastically interesting 3-hour breakfast with Prime Minister Putin, engaging leaders at the highest levels. That was 4 years ago, and this next slide is from Los Cabos just a year ago. And we are starting a new era of engagement in terms, now that your election is over, our election is over. We have sent here Tom Donilon, our National Security Advisor. He was here last month. Secretary Kerry was here just 10 days ago. In fact, he was in this room right here. In June, our 2 presidents will meet in Northern Ireland. And in September, stay tuned, President Obama will come to Russia again. And we hope, by the way, we might have the chance to do an event with students when he comes. All right, engaging leaders, number 1, very important. Second one, in terms of engagement, of government-to-government engagement. We created something called the Bilateral Presidential Commission, which now has over about 2 dozen working groups. And the reason is that when we came to the government, we didn't see enough horizontal connectivity between our governments. There was not enough connection at the ministerial level. And so we created what we call the BPC to help engage our governments, not just at the top, engaging business. This is just a photo from when your president was last, President Medvedev was in Washington in 2010. And at this meeting are a lot of billionaires. The Russians were richer than the Americans in this room, by the way. Mr. Prokhorov was there and many other folks were there. But we also had a lot of small business people as well to emphasize business-to-business ties, not just between the richest people in our economies and the biggest corporations, but small business as well. Next, engaging civil society. This is a photograph between the Vice President and leaders of civil society here at Spatzer House. Next slide, please. And engaging political society. You all probably can't see that in the back very well, can you? But that's the back of Barack Obama's head. That's who that is. I'm right next to him. And across from him is a guy named Gennady Zyuganov. That's who's across from him. Next to him is Deputy Mizulina. And to the left is Boris Nemtsov. And all other political society is represented in that meeting, which took place in July of 2009. And I put that photo up there and the civil society to remind you that this practice of dual-track engagement is a policy we've been following from the very beginning of our administration. Next slide. Engaging youth. I would like to see us do more of that, and that's, I am practicing our policy right now, right? I am fulfilling my orders in terms of our policy and what we're doing. And here's the president playing basketball with some Russian basketball players at the basketball court at the White House. I also am playing basketball there too, you can't see me. Your ambassador, he's right here. He's a great guy, Sergei Kislyak, but as you can see from his body posture and his tie, he was not ready to play basketball that day. Next slide, religious leaders. That's part of societal engagement. Next slide, all of society. It is our policy to try to reach out to all aspects of society, irrespective of your political, religious, or economic orientation for that matter. A meeting with me, or a meeting with one of my diplomats at the embassy, does not mean that we endorse you or we support you. It means that we want to engage with you to learn your perspective and to try to increase connectivity between our societies. I just put this slide up because this was in this room. You can see the same room. Overflow crowd just like this one. And it was the night of the inauguration where we watched President Obama's speech on inauguration. Finally, on this, and then I'm going to get to results and then take your questions. We have a concept which we call peer-to-peer dialogue. And the idea is a very simple one. We want to engage with you directly. Chinovnik to student. That's what we're doing right now, right? So government person to non-governmental people. And that's part of what we want to do. But we also want to get away. We want to get out of the way and try to strengthen ties between Russian society and American society that do not involve the government. It's difficult, it's hard, because your society has different interests than our society, but this is something that President Obama is particularly focused on. And you know why? Because you may not know this, but President Obama's first job, real job, it's some minor jobs, but his first real job out of law school was a civil society leader. He was the head of a non-governmental organization in Chicago. So this is not just abstract for him. This is kind of his heart and soul. But he doesn't believe that the government, our government, should organize civil society. We should be in relations with them, but we shouldn't organize them. And so we're trying to do some things differently in that way. Okay, I'm talking too long, so let's go a little bit faster here. Skip the people-to-people dialogue. Skip the fields. Well, just a moment just to remind you that every single day, and I'm always impressed with it when I talk to my astronauts, there's all kinds of interaction between our societies and our governments going on that you never read about in the press. And I think that's important to remember just how complex relations between our two countries are. And the reason they're so complex and broad is because we're big, important countries in the international system. Okay. Let's skip the respect quotes because I want to get to results in your questions. So we'll skip respect, we'll skip respect, we'll skip respect, and we'll get to results. And here I'm going to be fast. First one, ending wars. Now notice, I just told you how our strategy applies to the means with Russia. But now I've pivoted back to the way we define results for us. And I leave it to Mr. Kislyak and others to do the same slides for them. And at each point, I'm just going to go through exactly the same list, 6 points, and then end. And what I want, the main takeaway of the next 6 slides is on almost all major issues that matter to the United States of America. We see our relationship with Russia as enhancing our security and economic interests, not in competition. And even with the drama of the last year and a half, we see the balance being overwhelmingly in this direction. So ending wars. First, Iraq, we had no disagreement with you. We had no disagreement with President Putin. I just was with President Putin several days ago when he met with Secretary Kerry, and when he criticized us about the war in Iraq, Secretary Kerry said, yeah, I agree. Yes, I was. I ran for president to stop the war in 2004. That was Secretary Kerry. And Secretary Obama was the first presidential candidate on the Democratic side to come out against the war. So we have no disagreement whatsoever with what is arguably the most important priority for President Obama in his first term. Second, Afghanistan, same deal. No disagreement, but here, I would argue, it's not just a lack of disagreement, it's real cooperation on things of vital national interest to us, and I would wager interest to you too, or your government wouldn't be doing it. And in particular, if I could go to the next slide, I want to bring your attention to something called the Northern Distribution Network. And when we came into the government, this is a supply route. You probably can't see that map in the back. But this is a set of supply routes that go all the way from Virginia all the way to Afghanistan. And Russia is a vital contributor to these supply routes, both in terms of air routes and rail routes, by railroad and by airplanes. And when we first came to the government, we have 2 supply routes, the northern route and the southern route, which goes through Pakistan. The balance, and don't quote me on this, please, because if you want to know the exact facts, I'll tweet it to you tonight. But because I don't have it in front of me. But roughly, when we came to power, when we came to government, it was 95% through the south and 5% through the northern distribution network. Now that's about 55 through the north and 45 through the south. Incredibly important part of our effort to conduct the war and our effort to get out of Afghanistan. Second, fighting terrorism. Major priority for the United States. I'm sure you know the statistics on how we're fighting and how many terrorists we have killed in the fight against terrorism under our administration. And most recently, of course, with the tragedy in Boston, I think that we have now been reminded about our common interests and our common objectives regarding this objective. Third, well, just a sidebar. This is our troops preparing for future combat together and fighting terrorism, parachuting together in the state of Colorado, by the way. Third, Asia pivot. This is a priority for the administration that was recently articulated. And the way I would describe how it relates to Russia is, from our point of view, we don't see a contradiction in what you're trying to do in Asia and what we're trying to do. On the contrary, we think that both in the security dimension and in economic institution building, we have common interests there. And we welcome the new push by your administration, by President Putin, most recently at the APEC conference, to play a greater role there. We think Russia has a vital role to play in the Asia-Pacific region. Fourth, Prague agenda. President Obama gave a very important to us speech in Prague in the first year of our administration in spring 2009. Here, Russia is, in our view, a vital partner on some of the most important security issues that we face. Most obviously, the New START Treaty, which we signed with Russia 2 years ago. But second, and I would say usually under-noticed, not reported as well as we would like, our cooperation on Iran and North Korea in fighting proliferation of nuclear technology, we think has been closer than ever before. We're going to need that moving forward because neither of those two issues have been resolved yet. And then finally, on what we call the lockdown of nuclear materials around the world, we had a big conference in Washington 4 years ago and then another one in Korea. Obviously, our most important partner in that struggle and meeting those objectives is Russia. Fifth, economic ties. Again, we see this as a win-win outcome in terms of American interests and Russia's interests. And because we did, we think we've done some very concrete things to try to enhance economic cooperation. Most importantly, and I personally played a role in this when I was at the White House, working with your government to gain Russia's membership into the World Trade Organization. We think this is a fantastic achievement for Russia, but also an achievement that is in our national interest. Two, the repeal of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment and the creation of PNTR, Permanent Normalized Trade Relations with Russia. For 3 or 4 decades, American administrations promised that. We did it. Third, a new visa regime. Does anybody have a 3-year visa, multiple entry? All right, so that's progress. That's progress. That's the beginning. By next year, I hope everyone in this room will have a 3-year multiple entry visa. And I personally will get it for you. No, don't email me. Please. Do not tweet me about visas. Because there's very little I can do about it. But we heard from our business community. We asked them, what's the most important thing we could do to facilitate business? They said to reform the visa regime. We did it. And then there's a host of other things here. But this, to me, is pretty clear in terms of what our interests are here. Next slide, please. The trade is not what we would like, and your president reminds my president about this all the time. These numbers are too small, but they're moving in the right direction. And I will tweet out these slides, by the way, later tonight, and I'll put it on Facebook so you can go through them at your leisure, both in Russian and English. But I have in here just some of the examples of our trade together. Okay, why don't we just go through those quickly. U.S. investment in the Russian economy. Let's go through that. One piece I want to just focus on, go through that one too. This one. For decades, we did not want you or your money or your businesses in our country. We didn't. We didn't want you there. Because we didn't think you were there to do business. We thought you were there to do other things. And I'm talking about the Soviet era. And for many, many years, we have been trying to get beyond that Cold War legacy. Our administration has taken some very aggressive steps to be very blunt. So let me be really blunt right now. We want your money. We want you to invest in America. We want Prokhorov to invest in America. As a basketball fan, I'm really glad that he bought the Brooklyn Nets because they're a hell of a lot better now than they used to be. So spasibo большое for that investment. We want Mr. Pompiansky's investment, TMK, and we want your investment in our companies, in the stock market and elsewhere. We are not afraid of Russian investment in America anymore. And this is something that we are going to be focused particularly on in the next 3.5 years of the Obama administration. Okay, let me finish quickly. Let's skip innovation, if we may, and let's get to the 6th and finally, universal values. This, of the 6, just to be clear, is where we have our most trouble I think, in our relationship right now. And it principally has to do with the Arab Spring and domestic developments here in Russia. I've listed here some major disappointments from our perspective of things that have happened over the last 18 months in our relationship with your government. But I want to emphasize that it's not as black and white as it's sometimes portrayed. Because at the same time that we support universal values, we also support principles of sovereignty. In fact, hold that thought, and I'll end with that thought, because it's at the last slide. So let me get to that. And let me just end the number one agenda item: Syria, non-proliferation second, reducing nuclear stockpiles, missile defense, trade investment, and society-to-society contacts. Let me just say a word about 2 or 3 of those and then stop. First, Syria. In our opinion, and I've been working on Syria from the very beginning, both in my White House job and here, we actually think that we share many objectives with your government regarding Syria. And I just spent a marathon session with Secretary Kerry, with Foreign Minister Lavrov. We ended the dinner at 2 a.m. It was a long evening of negotiation over Syria. And this is the way that I would summarize where we're at right now. We want to end the bloodshed and support humanitarian needs there. We want to avoid state collapse. We both, our countries, believe that that would be bad for Syria, bad for the region, and eventually bad for Russia and bad for the United States. Third, we both support a political transition that meets the legitimate aspiration. Well, I should stop saying we both. I'm talking about our country. We support the political transition that meets the legitimate aspirations of the Syrian people. And I think we made some progress in talking about that when Secretary Kerry was here a few weeks ago. And of course, we want to avoid terrorists from coming to power in Syria. We share all of those objectives. Our disagreement has been about the means. First, and the hardest, is how to structure this dialogue. How do you get to number 3? It's hard. And second, related to that, is the timing and the place of President Assad's departure. Our view, and I'll just emphasize our view, is that a political transition cannot take place that involves Mr. Assad. But we both agree that it has to be through a political transition, a negotiated transition, not one settled on the back. Second, missile defense. Here I'm a big optimist. I am incredibly optimistic. This is not a real issue in terms of tensions in U.S.-Russia relations. And I think we've made some real progress recently in terms of us understanding our capabilities and intentions of both countries. And I actually think we're going to find a way forward, maybe to cooperate, but at least we're going to agree to disagree and not let the rest of our relationship be held captive to this issue. I'm actually fairly optimistic about that. Hardest 3 issues moving forward. And in many ways, I'm too old to solve them all. I'm too far gone. In many ways, this is the challenge for you all that are going to be involved in the development of relations with my country over the long haul. So this is my challenge to you. 1, avoiding zero-sum competition that ultimately makes losers out of both of our countries. 2, managing our differences over values. And I want to just digress on this for a minute, because we also believe in state sovereignty. And I have 2 quotes there from President Obama. 1, he said, America has an interest in, quote, in democratic governments that protect the rights of their people. But in the same exact speech, he said, quote, state sovereignty must be a cornerstone of international order. How to promote both of those sets of values in cooperation with our governments and our societies, I think, is a long-term challenge that you all ultimately will be responsible for. And finally, getting beyond Cold War stereotypes. I'm actually pretty optimistic about this one, because when I talk to people your age, I get really optimistic. When I talk to people my age, I get depressed. And I say this it's about people in America, and people in my government, and people here in your society, and people in your government. But, you know, it's over, baby. Cold War ended. We have too many big, real threats to be dreaming about threats that are now almost 3 decades in the past. And so the last thing I want to say, I want to do anything and everything I can as ambassador to contribute to this. And if you have concrete ideas for how I can help, let me know. Either tonight or later on social media or in a different way. So thank you very much, and we'll take some questions.